Welcome back to the Philosophy of Half-Life, the series in which I talk about obscure and often overlooked topics in Half-Life and analyze them down to their barest bones. At the point of me writing this script, it's been almost 1.5 years since I uploaded my video on Half-Life and humanity. I strongly recommend you check that one out as well if you like, but there's no need to watch them in chronological order, so you can keep on watching this one without any worries. In this video, I'm going to focus on consciousness in Half-Life, and in particular the Vortigaunts, which gives us many interesting insights within Half-Life's lore and opens up a lot of interesting questions to ponder. As I've said before, I recommend being somewhat familiar with Half-Life's main lore to get the most out of this video. But to summarize, and for those of you who may be unfamiliar, in Half-Life there is an alien species called the Vortigaunts. The Vortigaunts appear as benevolent creatures to the player and the rest of the humans, at least in Half-Life 2 and the later games, after they have been freed from enslavement by the Nihilanth in Half-Life 1. They appear to the player several times, and they are helpful and friendly towards everyone fighting against the Combine. But though they are an advanced and intelligent species, they don't seem to rely on advanced technology and machinery like the Combine or even the humans. Instead, they seem to possess an almost magical-seeming ability stemming from what they call the vortessence, a sort of hive mind that, among other things, allow the Vortigaunts to share their thoughts telepathically with one another. And it is this very existence of the Vortigaunts' hive mind within the narrative of Half-Life that is such an interesting topic, and that upon deep analysis opens up a lot of strange and interesting questions. There are a few of those questions I'd like to stick to in this video, and I'm going to try my very best not to stray too far from them. These are: what is the vortessence, and how does this telepathy-like ability function? How can consciousness be shared telepathically across space and time? Are there fundamental things about the Vortigaunts' consciousness that differs from humans, and if so, in what way? And finally, perhaps the most important question of all: what is consciousness? Let's begin by trying to answer that last question first. Exactly what is consciousness? Some basic theory is needed to proceed here. Philosophers in the field of metaphysics like to speculate on the definition of consciousness using two fundamental main perspectives, that of materialism and dualism. Materialism argues that consciousness arises from the physical, material world, while dualism argues that consciousness is an entirely separate property that isn't necessarily tied to anything physical. Materialism says that consciousness is something that can only exist because of all the chemical processes inside our brains, while dualism says that there is something more non-physical to consciousness. And these theories seem to state complete opposite things and seem incompatible at first glance. And given our progress of modern science, to many people, materialism probably seems like the most logical explanation for the origin of consciousness. After all, our very awareness and mind does exist because of all the complex electrochemical and neurological reactions in our brains. And our brains are made of physical stuff: cells, molecules, atoms, etc. In other words, matter. Consciousness is therefore, according to materialists, a property that cannot exist without physical matter to create it. And that seems very logical indeed. But is it possible that neither materialism or dualism is right or wrong, and that perhaps both may be right or wrong, in a sense. If you are, as I said before, familiar with the lore of Half-Life, you might know that the Vortigaunts have the ability to share a sort of hive mind they call the Vortessence. In-game, this presents itself as the ability for each Vortigaunt to feel the emotions and thoughts of other Vortigaunts.
Communion of the Vortessence and that other, a deeper mystery. No deeper than the void itself.
Every Vortigaunt probably seems to naturally be born with this ability, and we know from some examples of in-game dialogue that most Vortigaunts we meet can remember the events of Black Mesa.
We see you still in Black Mesa. Clearly we see you in the Nihilant's chamber. We are there still in observance of your final stroke. We remember the free man. We are coterminous.
With very few exceptions, every Vortigaunt in-game has a connection to the Vortessence. They remember being enslaved by the Nihilanth. They see and remember everything that every other living Vortigaunt can see and remember, no matter how far they're separated from one another.
We are a tapestry woven of Vortessence. It is the same for you if only you would see it.
This hive mind indeed seems to cross the barrier of space and time, and interestingly enough violates one of the most important laws of physics that we know of currently, the speed of light. More on that later, I suppose. A theory about the Vortessence that I have is that their consciousness is of a higher level than of human minds, and that it stems from some sort of brain anatomy that the Vortigaunts have that humans don't. But if this is the case, how does this thought communication happen? If materialism is right, and thoughts are created and bound by physical matter in the brain of an individual, then there is no way to transfer those thoughts, since that would require the transfer of, well, matter. So how can thoughts in Half-Life be shared telepathically across space and time? That does seem to contradict materialism, and there are two main conclusions to draw from this. Either materialism is wrong, and thoughts are not completely physical, or there is some kind of physical medium or field that propagates thoughts across space-time. I invite you now to ask yourself a seemingly simple question. Where does consciousness begin and where does it end? If consciousness is an emergent property of matter, what level of complexity does a living organism need to have in order for it to have consciousness? If consciousness is tied to the inner workings of the brain, how many neurons are needed for consciousness to arise within it? How far back in time down the tree of evolution must we travel to find the exact point in time and space where consciousness starts existing? Does it start with the development of sensory organs? Does it start with simple molecular interactions inside a single-cell organism? Does it begin with the first ever created organic molecule? On which level of complexity must a nervous system exist to be able to possess that which we call consciousness? How intelligent must a creature be to be conscious? Because, since all matter seems to originate from the same point of space and time, aka the Big Bang, 13.7 billion years ago, could it be that this is the beginning of consciousness? Does consciousness actually begin with the creation of the universe itself at the very moment of the Big Bang? Now you may start to see how hard it is to come up with a universal definition of consciousness. If one approaches things from this point of view, then it seems that consciousness doesn't have a clear beginning. But that seems almost absurd, because then it would be logically correct to say that a rock is conscious, that a tree possesses some sort of awareness of the physical world, that a mere molecule possesses some sort of awareness of the world around it, some sort of consciousness. And that's just absurd, right? Or is it? Because if all matter in the universe, if every single atom and elementary particle ultimately has the same source, the same origin, then it would not be unreasonable to say that consciousness has no definite origin. If all matter in the universe originates from the same point in time, how then can we accurately, materialistically determine when and how consciousness comes into being, or define what it actually is? Another question is, can things exist without the physical world? If consciousness comes from physical reality, then it seems that the answer is no. But then again, consciousnesses can create all sorts of things that have no physical property of their own. For instance, an idea, something that exists in the mind itself, the mental image of, say, an apple, or the concepts of something being good or bad, like justice. What does the concept of justice look like? What does ethics look like? Can you imagine what they look, sound, taste, or feel like in your head? Probably not. Maybe you can, but probably not. These things have no physical form, but they do exist. At least we say that they do, because we are conscious. These concepts are formless, constructed and brought into existence purely by our thoughts. A follow-up question to ask then is, would the concepts cease to exist just because there is no mind out there to think about them? Maybe they would. Then again, maybe not. Really, when you think about it, from this point of view, the only two possible conclusions to draw are either that 1. There is no such thing as consciousness, or 2. That consciousness is everything and everywhere, and that there are simply different levels on which it exists. And that brings me back to my original point about the Vortigaunts. Because, in regards to the Vortigaunts, Half-Life seems to go along with this theory. As I said before, I think that the ability of the Vortigaunts arises from some sort of anatomy inside their brains that humans don't possess. Much like an animal may be conscious, but compared to human brains, its consciousness is limited to a certain level. So while a human might be conscious, we can't get access to a shared hive mind like the Vortigaunts can, because our brains have an anatomical limit to them. The Vortigaunts actually remind me of a very real phenomenon, that of fungi and their mycelium. With most species of fungi, and let's take ordinary mushrooms as an example, there is a web of interconnected threads deep under the surface of the earth called the mycelium. Separate mushrooms may spring up from this biochemical web of mycelium and appear on the surface, looking very much like individual little mushrooms. But they aren't really individuals, are they? Not if they are connected by the same web that brought them into existence. And each mushroom is connected to the mycelium, and the mycelium acts as a sort of path of communication, although slow, as the communication functions on a chemical level. And perhaps the Vortigaunts' hive mind functions similarly, but in a more metaphysical way. Perhaps they are connected via some sort of invisible web of consciousness, with the Vortigaunts springing up from it like mushrooms and appearing as individuals, even though they all stem from the same source and are connected to one another through this intricate web of consciousness.
We are a tapestry woven of vortessence. It is the same for you if only you would see it.
Another interesting thing about the Vortigaunts is that they, very similarly to the Combine, appear pretty much completely identical. Within the narrative of Half-Life, there doesn't seem to be a distinction between individuals, but the Vortigaunts are different from the Combine. While the Combine have artificially altered the minds and bodies of their members to look and act completely alike in order to follow orders like the intricate workings of a giant machine, the Vortigaunts have done no such thing. And I think it's because of this shared hive mind, the vortessence, that eliminates individuality in a sense. If you can sense and feel each moment in time through the eyes and minds of every other member of your species, how would that affect an entire society with this ability? Would it not, on some larger level at least, shrink the individual and emphasize some larger scope of existence, a larger we, a single individual instead of smaller ones? But how would it be explained scientifically if this is the case? A lot of things in our own physical world need no physical matter to propagate it. We used to think, for instance, that light waves, like radio waves and such, were propagated through the ether, which has been dismissed by physicists long since, because now we've discovered the existence of the electromagnetic field and its interaction with a photon. Today we know that light waves are propagated because of electromagnetism, and that massive objects like the Earth have gravitational fields around them. So maybe in the Half-Life universe, the vortessence uses some sort of similar field to transfer thoughts across space and time, similar to these other kinds of fields. Maybe in Half-Life there is something like a consciousness field, where thoughts can travel across space and time, just like the invisible fields of gravity and electromagnetism. Although the question remains whether or not this transfer of thought is limited by the speed of light or not. We just don't know. We can only wonder. But perhaps, after all, not all Vortigaunts naturally possess this ability. Maybe not all Vortigaunts are born with the ability to communicate via thoughts. Maybe it functions in a way that's different from regular communication, or they are simply not equally skilled in practicing this ability. We have seen examples of Vortigaunts who have been cut off from the vortessence. I'm going to show some examples for context, and warning, minor spoilers ahead for Half-Life Alyx coming up. Skip to this point in the video to avoid it entirely. In Half-Life Alyx, for example, Alyx meets a Vortigaunt who has suffered a brain injury. This Vortigaunt is unable to access the vortessence anymore. They say so themselves.
I have a brain injury.
Oh, I'm sorry to...
My brain is injured.
That's terrible,
Ow.
and I...
The Combine drilled here. I am severed from the vortessence. I am alone in my head.
I'm sorry.
The Combine had other
And here is another one from the game who has been artificially blocked by the Combine from accessing the Vortessence, describing the experience within the machine as dark and quiet.
We have been trapped in the dark.
You're free now. It's okay. Your friend sent me.
The Alyx Vance. You are our friend.
What are they doing to you here?
What they do to us all.
Therefore, it seems logical to infer that the access to the Vortessence does stem from some sort of physical anatomy inside the Vortigaunts' brains, which makes this communication possible. And so that is an argument in favor of materialism, which, in case you don't remember, says that consciousness and mental states is something that can only exist because of real physical matter. And yet another thing I find interesting here is that despite the Vortigaunts' ability to share consciousness via their hive mind, they still communicate with spoken language. We see them talk with one another in their native tongue. If they can freely communicate with one another via thoughts, then the existence of a language almost seems like an unnecessary thing. So why do they also speak? Logic says that there has to be a reason for this too. Perhaps a necessity that becomes apparent when they need to communicate with other species, for instance, or, as I've said before, when a member of their society gets cut off from the Vortessence and loses the ability to share the thoughts of other Vortigaunts. So, if there is such a higher realm or field of consciousness that some beings can access, can the Vortigaunts only communicate with one another? Or is it possible that they can also somehow sense the thoughts and emotions of humans or other species within the game? Or is that unavailable to them too, cut off somehow, existing on a different frequency or something? I can't answer this in any conclusive way, so I'll just leave those questions hanging open. But like we humans could try and explain algebraic geometry to a dog, and they would never be able to understand it because their minds are simply not built for that kind of complex thinking, maybe there is something similar with the Vortigaunts. My theory is that somewhere along their species' evolution, they unlocked this ability to share each other's thoughts and to access this web of consciousness. Perhaps it happened through a mutation in their brains, or by something else. We don't know. We can only observe the facts before us and ask the questions. And another question that arises is, how much of time can the Vortigaunts witness through one another's eyes? From a few quotes in-game, it at least seems like they can perceive the past, but it's uncertain if they can perceive the future as well.
We bear witness to the bright eternity of the Nylon's demise. The way ahead is dark for the moment.
And another thing. I do wonder how the Vortigaunts view the humans. The humans in Half-Life have no conscious connection with one another, although the Vortigaunts seem to hint at certain things that may suggest this throughout the games. Perhaps they know that the possibility of developing a species-bound hive mind is possible, and that in the future this ability may be achieved by the humans as well. They almost seem like guides at certain points, benevolent and all-knowing, sympathetic and patient. And if humans suddenly all gained the ability to share one another's thoughts, I wonder how that would affect our way of life and our way of interacting with one another. In fact, there are times where the Vortigaunts hint at Gordon being able to share some sort of conscious connection with those around him.
How many are there in you? Whose hopes and dreams do you encompass? Could you but see the eyes inside your own, the minds in your mind, you would see how much we share. We are you, free men, and you are us.
Gordon and other characters, in fact.
You bear some traits we thought innate to Vortigaun. Almost Vordo, this bond between you.
Alright, so it's time to wrap up and summarize what we've talked about. Is consciousness materialistic or dualistic in the world of Half-Life? I don't know. Things seem to point to both conclusions, honestly, and perhaps it is both. The ability to access the Vortessence seems to be tied to the Vortigaunt's brain functions, so that's definitely tied to the physical world and an argument in favor of materialism, but it's still unclear how it works beyond that. For instance, when a Vortigaunt dies, does their consciousness remain within the Vortessence? If yes, then that might indicate the reality of dualism, because there is no longer anything physical to retain it. If no, then it seems that consciousness is materialistic. But if it is materialistic, then some medium is needed to propagate that consciousness from between one mind to the other. Perhaps like a consciousness field, very similar to electromagnetism, like I mentioned earlier. Perhaps consciousness in Half-Life becomes an entirely new property of the universe once it's been created, something that might have required the physical world to be created, but which can then detach itself from it and exist independently from that point onward. That's the end of my thoughts about consciousness in Half-Life. I hope you enjoyed my rambling about dreadfully existential things without reaching absolutely no kind of conclusion whatsoever, but that's the beauty of metaphysics, and the beauty of the world that is Half-Life. In the next video, I'd like to talk about time, because just like humanity and consciousness, time plays a central role in the bigger metaphysical narrative of the Half-Life lore, so it does seem very appropriate that this is my next topic. And the Half-Life center topic of focus in regard to time is, of course, going to be the G-Man. So stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for watching this video. Consider giving it a like and subscribing if you've enjoyed this series so far, because I definitely enjoy creating this content and I intend to continue it. I really hope you have a nice day, take care of yourselves, and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye bye.